Good evening, everybody. My name is Anthony Velarde, and I'm bringing to you analysis of Hispanic peoples of New Mexico. Opiate substance use disorder is a cultural or environmental issue. I am doing this as part of my drugs and behavior class with San Juan College, Psych 2310-503W, under Assistant Professor Nicole Leisman. I want to thank you all for taking the time to listen to this, as I did put quite a bit of work into going over it. So in this analysis, I did have to extrapolate a lot of information from my paper and break it down into a little bit more simpler presentation, as there was a lot of information in my original presentation, or rather my original paper. So real quick, some topics that we can cover in this are: what are opioids and opiates, the mechanism by which they cause their effect. Is there evidence to support that Hispanic people of New Mexico struggle with an unusually high rate of opioid abuse? Is there evidence to support that this is an environmental issue? Is it a cultural issue? And of course, contextual information regarding national statistics. First and foremost, what are opioids/opiates? For those of you guys who have taken this class are probably pretty familiar with this, but opiates are chemical structures that, when ingested into the body, mimic the effect of endorphins on the brain. Primarily, opiates are derived from the poppy plant. Drugs like heroin and morphine are chemically very close to pure opium. Opioids are synthetically created chemicals which have a very similar structure and mechanism of effect in the human brain. Drugs like hydrocodone, fentanyl, oxycodone are examples of opioid drugs. Let's talk a little bit about the mechanism of their effect. Endorphins are the brain's natural painkillers and attached to what are called opioid receptors. So there are specific places in the brain, specifically neural receptors that have been come to be named opioid receptors. That when opiates or endorphins attach, they produce a euphoric effect. It also produces other physiological effects, such as constriction of pupils, reduction in felt pain, respiratory depression, and a reduction in heart rate. Some key points to consider. At the national level, 7.1% of all Hispanic peoples report a substance use disorder. This comes from addiction by race, gender, and more. Who does it affect? Footprints to recovery, drug rehab, and alcohol addiction treatment centers, 2022. So again, that's at the national level. However, in New Mexico, it's been reported that 57.6 per every 100,000 people of Hispanic ethnicity visit the emergency room in 2021 for opioid overdose. And though I didn't put it in here, it did cite in the original study that there was some limitations on that data, as there was roughly a little under 1,000 people that didn't report any kind of ethnicity on their intake on coming into the emergency room. Now, in New Mexico, out of all illicit and prescription substances, heroin is the #1 reported misused drug at the time of intake. Roughly a total of 778 in the year reported, specifically 2020. This information came from New Mexico Recovery Connection. White or Caucasian was the next highest number of emergency room visits per ethnicity. For specific opioid overdoses at 41.6, and this was specifically in New Mexico Substance Abuse Epidemiology Profile 2021. So there's some key arguments I want to go over this. Over the years, personally, I have heard anecdotal reports, and others as well, that would seem to indicate that Hispanic people of New Mexico, it's an acronym I put together for this presentation and for the paper, HPNM, suffer a higher rate of opioid abuse. Is this true, or is it a misconception? And could it be an environmental or cultural issue? So some contributing factors of New Mexico that make it somewhat unique are specifically the rural nature of New Mexico. For those of you who live here, obviously you know what I'm talking about. Approximately 33% of all New Mexico residents reside in a rural area. With a population percentage of roughly 50.1% of all New Mexico residents being of Hispanic ethnicity, this would lead to approximately 349,817 Hispanic people of New Mexico living in a rural area. Now, I didn't go over the exact methodology in this, but I did extrapolate that number based on information provided by Rural Health Information Hub, Rural Health for New Mexico Overview 2022. Basically, I multiplied the percentage of total residents in New Mexico by that 50.1% number, and further extrapolated the 33%. Of course, there is somewhat of a limitation to this, as we can't guarantee that there is an equal distribution of Hispanic people of New Mexico living across the entire state. Nationally, Hispanic people do not abuse opioids and opiates at a rate higher than other ethnicities. This would seem to kind of bring to conclusion my presentation here. However, I think we can go into a little bit more detail. It's roughly about 4% of the total population that abuse opioids and opiates. If you take the national percentage of Hispanic peoples who abuse opioids and opiates and multiply by the number of Hispanic people who live in a rural area, again that number that I extrapolated earlier, you arrive at 13,992. This might seem rather low. However, we do need to take into consideration underreporting and data. Obviously, that's probably a relatively significant issue, especially consider the cultural implications that come with being a Hispanic person of ethnicity here in New Mexico. Ethnic Hispanic, rather. According to SAMHSA, in their opioid crisis in the Hispanic Latino population, one additional factor we may have to take into consideration here is that specifically high schoolers seem to abuse illicit prescription opioids and opiates at a higher percentage than other ethnicities. Since students tend to be a multi-area residing ethnic group, or excuse me, demographic group, as they tend to come back and forth between their home and whatever urban area that they're residing in or school, we do have to take into consideration here that maybe they didn't exactly fall into the data that was collected here. So we do know that high schoolers abuse it at a higher rate, so we need to take that into consideration. So as I said at the bottom, this may add to the total number, however, we don't exactly know how much. So what does this tell us? The high number of emergency room visits among Hispanic people of New Mexico and the high rate of younger Hispanic people abusing opiates and opioids may contribute to the misconception that Hispanic people of New Mexico abuse these drugs at a higher rate. The trauma induced on the population and families of Hispanic people of New Mexico by the frequent ER visits in their community may cause people to falsely believe that more people are actually abusing the drug than is reality. So what do additional studies say? Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of data, and I did run into this issue, as others did as well, in gathering concrete data on what any of these variables have to play in the entire picture. One study, not conducted in New Mexico, found that the primary issue encountered by people who reside in a rural area are distance to travel, lack of childcare, lack of community support, and lack of economic resources, and an inability to take time away from work. In this particular study, they did select, I believe, 218 total participants of all various ethnic backgrounds and economic statuses. They did tend to find that those who had better family and community support did manage to do a little bit better in their recovery, maintaining sobriety a little longer than those who didn't. In addition to barriers to care, the lack of professional therapists and providers also causes significant problems for people living in a rural area, and by extension, obviously, Hispanic people of New Mexico who live in those areas. Economic issues are also causing a barrier to care. From what we understand, according to the study cited here, 21% of the total population residing in a rural area is living below the poverty level. This can only exacerbate the issues that they are experiencing. As we saw in the previous study, economic issues can be play a part, as well as mental health issues. So to summarize here, out of the data we've looked at, we can arrive at some relatively safe conclusions. Hispanic people of New Mexico do experience opioid/opiate overdose at a higher rate than other ethnicities, and this has only increased since 2010 through 2019 in the data collected by SAMHSA in 2016-2020 respectively. The rural nature of a large portion of the population does create unique issues and barriers to care for those Hispanic people of New Mexico who reside in a rural area, along with economic issues, a lack of providers, and mental health issues. This would all seem to indicate that the issue is an environmental one. So let's talk a little bit about historical trauma and mental health issues. Hispanic people of New Mexico, in general, are descendants from Spanish European settlers and those peoples of Native American descent that resided here. Over the last 300 years, Hispanic people of New Mexico have resided in New Mexico. They have been collectively traumatized from multiple different authorities, from the Catholic Church and the Inquisition, to the U.S. government in the form of extortion and unfair taxation, to the era of Jim Crow and segregation. Culturally, Hispanic people of New Mexico have a significant importance placed on familisimo, an idea that every person in a family or community has their place, and that deviation from this is frowned upon by the community. Logically, this leads to stress on communities and family members who struggle with substance use issues or mental health issues, as these deviate from the norm. In the journal, The Historic Trauma and Resilience of Individuals of Mexican Ancestry in the United States, a scoping literature review and emerging conceptual framework, the author writes that there is a significant lack of empirical evidence regarding the relationship between historical trauma and current mental health and substance use disorders experienced among Hispanic Americans. With that being said, it is difficult to arrive at any conclusion. However, some points will be hopefully addressed with further research. So some quick recommendations. In order to address the issues prevalent in New Mexico regarding the significant substance use and mental health issues, the following recommendations can be safely made. Improved access to care by reducing the cost and complexity of prospective providers becoming licensed and educated. Legislative changes to increase access to Medicaid paid transport options. Legislative changes to address the epidemic of opioid/opiate abuse. Reduction in availability of these substances and education for youth experimenting with these drugs. And last but not least, probably the most important, is a change in the hearts of the community themselves, removing the stigma against substance use treatment and improving support for those who ask for help. I want to thank you guys for taking the time to read this and listen to this.